אוקיי, ירא שמיים מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואבותינו, שלא יארע דבר תקלה על ידי, ולא אכשל בדבר הלכה, וישמחו בי חבריי, שלא אמר טמא טהור ולא על טמא, ולא על מותר אסור ולא על אסור מותר, ולא ייכשלו חבריי בדבר הלכה ואשמח להם, כי אדוני ייתן חוכמה מפיו דעת, ונגל עיניי ופיתה תלאות לתורתך. Kibalt. We are, Bezrat Hashem, at the beginning of Hilchot, talking last time a little bit about the guide for the perplexed, and we may end up speaking more about the guide today than about Hilchot, although I'd like to do Bezrat Hashem at least the first halacha. But I think it's important again to get a little more into Rambam's thinking about thinking, which the guide is. Let me just turn this up. So, in a fundamental way, I think the guide Rambam presents a theory of human knowledge. Thank you.
Did you speak about Rambam thought about man having this hara before that Adam Arishon or not?
About man having
Yetzer hara.
I did not speak about that. No.
Okay.
And we're not going to speak about that today either. At least that's not in my notes. All right, but the guide in terms of and the reason that I'm trying to bring all this together because I think now that we've gone through the Yesodei Torah, and we see the construction of the cosmos, I want to suggest that Rambam builds his whole theory, his whole understanding of humanity, his whole understanding of human personalities and qualities, which we're going to see in Hilchot. It's all of a piece with the way that the universe is structured. It's not by chance that he starts out with the structure of the cosmos, because it's kind of like, you know what, the notion of fractals, there are patterns that just repeat over and over again, and they repeat in larger scale and in smaller scale. And we're kind of just another working out at a different scale of all the processes of creation and of putting together the elements that he discussed.
Excuse me, if I insist, but
please.
All the ideas of הרגשות, טובים ורעות, לא חשוב מה, הם באים מארבע אש, מים.
Exactly, but that's exactly what I'm saying. Shabbat Tov. Well, you look sharp today. You always look sharp. Okay. So again, Rambam in the guide, he kind of presents a theory of knowledge, which in many ways is very similar to the theory of knowledge that's described in Tanya, right? That there's this notion of a flash of insight, and then we see something, and then we don't understand it. And in the guide, he says, my purpose in this letter, and remember the guide is basically a long letter to one pupil, he says, is for the truth to be glimpsed and then to be concealed. So what he's doing is kind of a meta teaching. He's revealing knowledge in the way that the human mind perceives or receives knowledge.
And what is the purpose of glimpsing and concealing?
So I want to say that, and I was thinking, a number of the sessions that we've had, a couple of people have kind of been very taken by notions of prophecy, and is this prophecy, or how do we get to prophecy, or how does prophecy play into this? And there is this body of scholarship, and I think it makes a lot of sense. There's certainly a strong argument that what Rambam was doing in the Guide for the Perplexed was he was basically writing a handbook of training for prophecy. And the fact that that Rambam himself perhaps never attained prophecy in his own life, we mentioned this once before, like every philosophical work is somehow or other also autobiographical. So some philosophers if you read like, I just recently reread Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling, which couldn't put it down. But if you've ever read it, it is very transparently his agony over his inability to have a proper love relationship with this woman, Regina, that he's totally fixated on, like, you know, and so it becomes...
categorical imperative?
No, that's Kant. And I can't tell you, I can't tell you what Kant's autobiographical content is, but so I think then there's kind of a passing, maybe it's a little bit, I'm looking at it a little maybe romantically, novelistically, but okay, this is, that we saw that Rambam makes reference to Baruch ben Neriah, who was the pupil and amanuensis of Yirmiyahu, the prophet. And Baruch ben Neriah is all ready for prophecy. He's done all the work according to the whole system that Rambam laid out, right? He perfected himself intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and imaginatively, and he's all ready to do it, and God says to him explicitly, no, it's not for you. And if you remember that in the guide, when Rambam talks about the notions of prophecy, right? He says there are basically three notions. There's the quote-unquote, the pagan notion, which is just kind of God decides that somebody's going to be a prophet and they speak prophecy. Then there's what he calls the notion of the philosophers, which is that a person trains himself and does all the right work and then prophecy comes to him. And he says is the view of the Torah, which is the same as the view of the philosophers with one key ingredient that's different, which is God.
Divine order.
Because for all of the work that we do, God decides whether or not we receive prophecy. We can all have trained ourselves, but it's God who decides whether we get prophecy. God comes to Baruch ben Neriah, and that's his proof text, and says, it's too much for you. You're not taking this on.
So is Rambam hoping to supersede that? Or?
I think Rambam, my understanding of this, and I'm kind of like, I wrote all these notes, which I thought we were going to be able to read through, but I see where it's okay. I think Rambam understands, as we said earlier, that's like, you said everything in the sublunar sphere is composed of the four elements. The four elements themselves are inert, right? Unlike everything in the spheres and above, they do not have self-awareness, and they don't have awareness of the other, and they don't have awareness of God, right? And even when it looks like, the four elements, it looks like this is only the element of water, but Rambam says no. The other three elements are also present in here, but water is the dominant element to the extent that we don't even recognize that the others are there, right? So why are we talking about this in terms of Hilchot De'ot, which is about personality, as he translates it here very usefully, laws of personality development, right? Why are we mentioning that? Because Rambam says in the very first paragraph, there are many, many different character traits in all human beings. And this one is different from that one. Not meaning this person, zo, is the de'ah, not ze. These character traits are all different one from another. Not that people are different, but the character traits are different, right? And they're all can be very, very, very different and very distant from one another, very dissimilar to one another, right? Yesh Adam shehu bar chema. There is one type of a person who is always angry, right? Koes tamid, always losing his temper. Yesh Adam she'dato miyushevet alav ve'eno koes klal. And then there are people who are like so calm and quiet and they never lose their temper at all, right? Ve'im yichas ka'as me'at. And if they get angry at all, they're only going to get angry like a little bit once every few years, right? So he's painting like two extremes, right? There's people who are constantly in a state of rage, and then there are people who's like, he can't get a rise out of them. And maybe once every few years, I say, I really wish you hadn't done that. And that's about as far as it goes, right? Yesh Adam shehu gevalev bioter. There are people who are very, very prideful, right? Yesh shehu shafel ruach bioter. And then there are people who are very, very, very humble, right? Yeshu bal ta'ava lo tispa nafsho mehaloch beta'ava. And then there are people who are like, they're so ruled by their appetites that they can never be satisfied from running after and trying to fulfill their appetites and trying to pursue their desires. And then there are yesh bal nefesh rahava shelo tispa nafsho mikol mamon halam. There are people who run after their appetites all the time. There are people who are so pure of heart that they don't even fulfill their own bodily needs. They take barely enough to stay alive. There are people who are so greedy that all the money in the world would never satisfy them. Right? And he quotes from Ecclesiastes, "Ohev kesef lo yisba kesef." The person who loves money will never be satisfied with money. People who right, exactly. A person who is fixated on having money, money's never enough for them. V'yesh mikatzer nafsho v'shedayo afilu davar ma'at shelo yaspik lo. And then there are people who are satisfied with something that's literally not even enough to keep them alive, right? V'lo yodof lehasig kol tov. And they don't even like put the effort into trying to fulfill their own fundamental needs because they are so withholding about themselves, right? People who shehu misagef asmo bera'av, people who torment themselves with hunger. B'kovetz al yado ve'eno ochel pruta mishelo. And then there are people who are like so. They're like they hold on. They're so stingy. They wouldn't spend a penny of their own money even to feed themselves because the money, remember Bob Hope? Was it right? I said, your money, your life. He said, I'm thinking with it. Right?
You may admit it.
Right. And then people it's so painful for them to even to spend $1, So he says, sorry. And in these ways, all other human qualities are similar. They all follow the same pattern. So people who are, as he translates it here, over-elated, manic and depressive, and stingy and very generous. Cruel and soft-hearted, the coward and the rash, and so on and so forth. Right? So,
does this have to do with knowing what portion of the Torah is ours?
Well, it's an interesting question. In a sense, I would say, in a sense, where he's going with it, or where we're starting from this, and why we went back to the four elements, right? Is that what we need to understand is that there are two perspectives that this first paragraph should call to our attention. One is that there are all kinds of people, all kinds of personalities. What he describes he's setting them up as counterbalanced, if you will, extremes, right? Incredibly generous, incredibly stingy, always in a rage, can't get a rise out of them, so on and so forth, right? Coward, foolhardy, brave, okay? Most people don't fit into these extremes, but most people fit somewhere along a continuum. Very few people fit right in the middle, which is where he's going to take us, to tell us that we should be in the middle. The golden path, the golden mean. The other aspect, though, which we need to understand from this is that and that's why it's so important that we understand the structure of the cosmos first, right? All of us have all of these qualities inside of us. We don't all express them the same way. And they're also not consistent with others. So there are going to be moments where we're going to go through a moment where we can't control our temper. Then we're going to go through a moment where nothing seems to bother us. We're going to go through moments where it bothers us tremendously that people aren't paying attention to us. And then we're going to go through moments where no matter how big a contribution we made, no matter what we've done, we don't want to take credit for it. So these are, are the human soul and the human personality, if you will. It's like this, all these four elements are poured into this big bathtub, right? And they're sloshing back and forth. And at any given moment, if you reach a cup in and take and dip it out, right, you're going to get a totally different combination of all of the qualities that make up all human beings. And so to your question of how does that talk about, how does that indicate our portion of Torah? Interesting. So this goes back to what what I'd written and what I was thinking we would do as an introduction here. Rambam's notion or his whole understanding of human knowledge, and by the way, just like this is a very important point, right? That he is very influenced by the thought of the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, as translated by and expressed in the writings of Arab philosophers, Arab thinkers. Okay, so remember, Rambam didn't read Greek. He didn't have Aristotle in front of him in Greek. He had translations of some of Aristotle's works, and he had a lot of commentary from thinkers who had read or had thought they read, or it's not clear exactly how much of actual Aristotle made it into the generation of Arab writers that influenced Rambam as well. But in terms of modern Western thought, the Greeks made a really, really significant contribution in that they came up with an idea of knowledge, a definition of knowledge. And when you talk about, like the Socratic idea of knowledge is, it's not inclusive, it's exclusionary, right? The idea is not how much we know, but rather to understand, as I can't remember who said this, is a great expression, right? The contours of our own ignorance, right? That there is, as Rambam is saying, we can't really know stuff. We get these glimpses, and we don't really hold on to them, right? But we get these glimpses, and sometimes depending on, I would say, depending on which, like the inner mix, how we're feeling at a given moment, and our interaction with our environment at the given moment, the flash of insight or the flash of knowledge that comes to us is going to be, we're going to perceive it differently. And that's exactly what I was saying before when I said that I think that Rambam in the guide, he's basically writing a handbook for prophecy, for prophetic training. Because the training for prophecy is exactly what we all need to do to fulfill ourselves as individuals. It's not a question of whether we're all going to be prophets, but it's the same process. Because the difference between the prophet and the human being is twofold. It's training, and then it's God's choice.
Were any of the prophets trained as such?
But the training, so the answer is yes. There are like schools for prophets, right? So if you go back to Sefer Shmuel,
what's the tuition?
If you go,
Eliyahu trained Elisha.
If you go and Yirmiyahu trained Baruch ben Neriah. When Baruch ben Neriah came to his graduation, God said, "No, sorry, I'm not signing your diploma." Right? But interesting, there are a couple of scenes in Sefer Shmuel, the Book of Samuel, where King Shaul goes up on the mountain, and all the prophets are up there, right? And it's like Woodstock. It's like prophet stock. They're up there and they're dancing naked and they're playing the tambourines and they're singing and they're carrying on, right? And it says, and mitnabim, and they start prophesying. And they just start prophesying. So, and then Shaul goes up there and he gets caught up in it and he starts prophesying, right? And this expression that comes up twice in Sefer Shmuel is Hagam Shaul ben Nevi'im. It's like, oh, even Shaul is like, he's one of the prophets, which is taken, it's a kind of yes, it's a critical, it's a sarcastic remark, like, oh, you're a prophet too, like, because you get caught up in the movement, right? So it's like, if you go to a jazz club, let's say, and you hear really, really good improvisation, right? So, if maybe like you played piano a little bit, or you played saxophone a little bit, or you played whatever instrument a little bit, and you get there and you go there, I'm sorry?
Shofar.
The shofar. But you're hearing somebody like one of the greats. You started taking saxophone lessons, and now you're sitting there, right, this close to Sonny Rollins. And he's carrying on, and you're just like so with it, okay? And you get it, and the music is moving you. You ain't Sonny Rollins, right? So you come back, and you feel like, I'm inspired. Hagam Shaul ben Nevi'im, right? You're also like, it's great that you're inspired. Do not mistake inspiration for achievement or for ability, right? And that's something that I think, This is one of the themes that comes up over and over again throughout Tanakh. It's Cain and Hevel all over again. It's Cain and Abel. It's like, oh, this is a great thing. I want to do it too. But that wasn't what you were put in the world to do. So our portion of Torah, it's a long, very, very long response to your question, but I think I'm making sense. You may all disagree. Our portion of Torah is, at any given moment, we're going to, when we focus on a Torah text, we have the ability to have some kind of an insight about it. And the insight that we have at that moment, which is why when we read the Torah over and over again, the annual cycle, right? You notice we read it every week. We say, oh, you know what? I never noticed that before. Oh, I have these new insights, right? Why? Because every time that we come back to the same text, we have a different blend of all of these qualities within us, a different blend of the moment, the experience, and you never know which part of all of this is going to affect us how, right? So just as Rambam says that, you have 100 prophets lined up and they've all got the same training and they all have perfected their own intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and imaginative faculties, right?
And God translate it differently.
Exactly. God gives each one of them exactly the same message. You're going to get 100 different messages, right? And so similarly, if we read the same text 100 times, we're going to have 100 different chidushim from reading that text. So there's a great, the Sfas Emes says, in the Pasuk, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek l'olam haba, every Jew has a portion. He says, what's your chelek? What's your portion? He says, you sit there in the Beit Midrash and you're learning and you're doing a Gemara and you're working on this really, really difficult Tosfot, and all of a sudden you get it. And you've been there for like 3 hours with your chavrus and all of a sudden now it clicks, now you understand it. You spend 3 hours. I don't know if you've had this experience, if you learned Gemara seriously, you've had this experience where like literally you've learned this much text and it's taken you 3 hours and now you finally get it. And then there's a feeling of triumph. You say, great. And you look up and you say, Kibalt, Baruch Hashem, I got it. And then the moment that you do that, you have this tremendous sense of despair. Because when you look up, what do you see? On the back wall of the Beit Midrash, hundreds of books. And you say to yourself, wait a minute, it just took us 3 hours to go through these 5 lines of text, and now we understand that I can live 7 lifetimes, I'll never even read all these books, much less understand them all. So says Sfas Emes, no, that's your chelek. Nobody else in cosmic history ever had, can have, will have the specific Torah insight that you just had. Right? So at any given moment, we are doing something incredibly important, which is we are giving back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu a new version of the Torah. So, our personal connection to the Torah, our personal part of the Torah is something that's alive, I think. It's something that, and by the way, it's like right from the beginning of the Gemara in Brachot, which talks about, God says, I give you the Torah and the mitzvah and the chukim and so on and so forth. And the rabbis say, yes, right. And that means that the process that starts on Har Sinai with God physically handing the luchot to Moshe Rabbeinu and then educating Moshe for 40 days and giving him the whole rundown, right? That process continues to this day. And what we're doing here today is a direct line back to that process, right? So we're not disconnected from Har Sinai. That was not a closed event. That opened the door that will never be shut. It took us being ready for that door to be. The door was like always open, right? It's like Hasidic Rebbe said. It's like the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. That's not that all of a sudden God decided to say this. This is part of what God is. But there was a convergence of events, of people and events at the time when we were all of a sudden able to perceive it. So. It's very important, I think, to recognize that although Rambam is going to talk about a person or a type of person or an activity or a type of activity, it's really important to remember that everything that he says, particularly in this Sefer, which is about human personalities, everything he says in every sentence of every page of the Sefer applies to all of us. And it's going to apply to all of us differently at different times in our lives. under different circumstances, but there is no negative quality from which we are exempt, and there is no quality of greatness that we cannot attain. And it's a tremendous gift to us. Rambam has this, he's like, what a gift to us that Rambam comes to us and says, no, give up. It's here, you can do this. You know, it's like, he's our cheerleader. It's great. Please.
Is there any commentary about the, I'll use the word validity of Rambam's belief in the accuracy of the Arabic translation of the Greek? Because we know when things are translated.
There's a lot of scholarly commentary about, you know, what did Rambam actually know. And by the way, it's not, you know, Rambam is not trying to teach us Aristotle. Rambam is trying,
Wants to teach truth.
In the guide, what he's saying is, you know, we touched on this last time, right? In the guide, he talks about our relationship to Torah as a palace, right? And he says it's like the imagery. It's very much like the imagery of approaching the Beit HaMikdash, like that we use, for example, when we talk about prayer, right? And he says, you know, there are ways to approach the palace, and then we can walk around the palace, and then we can find the entrance to the palace, and then once we're in the palace, we can find the different passageways to the palace, and the object of the game, if you will, it's like playing Mario Brothers, right? The object of the game is to get through to the central room, to the inner sanctum, to the throne room in the palace, right? And he says, if you and remember, he's writing this letter to this one pupil who said to him, you know, I've learned all this Torah, and I've learned all this science, and I've learned all this philosophy, and I'm confused. Mm-hmm. And Rambam says, yeah, it's confusing. So he says, but you're on the right path. Because he says, and people accuse him of being an elitist, you know, like as though there was something wrong with that, you know. And he says, he says, if you've studied a lot of Torah, you have formulated a lot of right opinions. Having the right opinion doesn't get you into the palace. To even be able to approach the gate of the palace and start to walk through that gate, you need to engage with the intellectual part of your mind. You need to be able to not just have the opinion, you need to be able to analyze the opinion, understand the opinion, express the opinion, teach the opinion. Right? So what his challenge is, he's basically saying that, you know, simple faith is very nice, but I think that one of the things he's pushing back against is he's pushing back against large, when I say schools, I mean literally schools, like large groups of people where they'll have a teacher who says, you know, don't question what I say. This is the way to do it, right? And Rambam is saying that's not learning Torah, that's memorizing Torah. You memorized a lot of Torah, kol hakavod, that's good. Now that you've memorized it all, you know, and so somebody's memorized it all and he says, oh, now I read this book by this Ara something guy and I'm very confused. And Rambam says, that's good. Now you're finally starting to use the unique brain, the unique mind that God gave you. Okay? It's okay to be confused. That's like the baseline human condition. It's called cognitive dissonance, right? That we don't understand how the world can operate the way that it operates because none of it makes sense. Rambam says, yes, that's right, you're on the right track. You know? So,
but that's not really cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, when you see evidence to completely disprove what you believe and you continue in the belief.
So, yes. And the cognitive dissonance part of it is that many people experience. Like today, I mean, there are many people who grow up in very rigid religious
Look
communities.
at the leftists.
You look at the rightists. Look at everybody. There are people who grow up in very rigid religious environments where they are told if they have to behave a certain way, they can't ask certain questions, they can't do this, they can't do that, they have to do this, they have to do that. And like literally, I mean, I've worked with a lot of young guys who like literally grew up in Haredi the Haredi community here, and the day that they asked one question, they were thrown out of yeshiva. Instead of being told, you're having a difficult time with this? Maybe I should, instead of a teacher saying, maybe I should like approach you differently because you're having a difficult time with it, it's like, oh, you questioning the way this works, this isn't the place for you.
But that's dictatorship.
But that's extremely widespread. You can't, we can't deny that. And what Rambam is saying is, it's because there's also the power structures of these, call them institutions of learning, right? It's the power structure. Because if you start telling students that they should think for themselves and question things, then there's a portion of them going to come to you one day and they're going to say, well, why should I listen to you? And on the one hand, as a teacher, when somebody says to me, well, why should I listen to you? A part of me is saying, Baruch Hashem, finally, but it's not my livelihood, right? And it's not I don't have a power structure of, all my Talmidim have to come and, kiss my ring or whatever it is, right? So, and Rambam is very clear on, he didn't get paid to teach Torah, right? And you can't say that out too loud nowadays, and this is one of the reasons I think that Rambam is not widely taught as Rambam in the yeshivas. When they use Rambam in most of the traditional yeshivas, they're learning Gemara, and then they say, well, okay, so what's the halacha? Well, we'll go, what does Rambam say? So they're going to look at Rambam in the Mishna Torah. They're going to look for his halachic breakdown because he's usually right, or he's usually hard to argue with, right? But the stuff that we're talking about here, this is, and in fact, there's a serious body of scholarship that says that Rambam kind of hid the message of the guide because it was such a controversial message. It's like he's telling people, don't do what the rabbis tell you. He's not telling people that. He's telling people that you have to think for yourself. But people, people come from one world where they're told they're not allowed to think for themselves. And then they open a book that tells them that they're supposed to think for themselves, so they feel like they have to, it's a binary choice, that they have to reject one or the other. Because they've been told all their lives, they've been told to reject that. Now once they open themselves to that, they say, oh, well, now I have to reject this. And Rambam's saying, no, you don't have to reject it. You're perplexed? Finally, you're starting to, we can integrate it. And how can we integrate it? We can't integrate it. The only person who can perhaps integrate it, all of it, all the time, is the Navi. The prophet is the person who has perfected themselves intellectually, such that when they get that flash of insight, if you will, of chokhmah, that they don't lose it. They don't necessarily understand it clearly, but they hold on to it and they work with it and they develop a message from it. Okay. So Rambam is saying, it's like, we all have these abilities within us, and we should
the ability to be prophets.
We all have, we all have an ability, just like the person that you just started taking saxophone lessons. You'll never be Sonny Rollins, but you can play the saxophone. But don't think that, don't think it comes to you without hard work.
Or maybe Charlie Bird. Maybe Charlie Bird.
Maybe.
He said that his writings are kind of a reflection of himself in a sense where he's at. So
I think there's an aspect. I think there's an aspect of that. Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like he was trying to achieve prophecy, from the way I'm understanding you saying it.
Yes.
But at the same time, when I was taught that there was no more prophecy, since the rabbis with idolatry and stuff and how they fought that, and because we didn't have that same pull towards idolatry, and also to balance it, we lost prophecy. This is how it was explained.
Yeah.
So how is he trying to achieve this when it's supposed to have been lost? You still thinks he can reach that?
Interesting question. I would say one statement that I will make is that if you look at the world around you today, the world that we live in, across the board, really? There's no Yetzer Hara for idolatry today? Really? It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
I think it was such a strong draw, then it was just unbearable.
And it's remained that way.
As we listen to the teaching of the Rambam and the prophets, it's speaking also to our modern society of what's known as the status quo. You're ostracized when you have independent thought. And what we're given by the Rambam is a yardstick that says, this is something that we need to measure up to, but we can only measure up to it if we come to these conclusions independently on our own. We have the tools and the yardsticks to be able to come to these conclusions, but we have to come to these conclusions outside of the current thought of the status quo in the society we're living in. You can take a look at in the United States, and there are many, many different factions that are ongoing at one time, and it's easy to fall into the thought of any one of those factions, the right, the left, the progressive, the environmentalists. But if you have independent thought within those groups and you come to separate conclusions based on all of the information that we have, now you're ostracized from those groups as you consider, what you've understood, and you push forward to the conclusions of reaching the yardstick that the Rambam is
yes,
has
but we
set
are
out
not
for
taught
us.
like this. I think 99% of Jewish teachings are contrary to this.
Or what?
Contrary.
Don't tell anybody what we're doing here.
I make a very simple example, very simple.
Because I struggled with this myself, because when they say there's not prophecy anymore, but yet when I read stories from the Rabbi and what he was able to, one after the next, y'all have all read them probably. I think, what is that?
Well, there's
The Rabbi himself, he was a great lover of the Rambam, but his teachings, they were not in that directions.
Yeah, okay.
They were in different directions.
Yeah. Largely. I would say that, I know people here in Jerusalem. I know a guy here who basically teaches a 2-year course in how to become a prophet. And
Any graduates?
Wishful thinking.
I am not taking his, I'm not
Is that with
studying.
the refund guarantee?
No, I'm not studying with him, but he's for real. And when I say he's for real, I don't mean that people who graduate from his little course now can go stand on a mountaintop and, the heavens open and they can tell us where to build the Beit HaMikdash. But that there are people like the Rabbi who they are more open to what's out there than other people. And there are ways that we can train ourselves to greater or lesser degree, depending on our own innate gifts or blockages, if you will, right? There are ways that we can train ourselves to be more open to things. There's a difference between, you ever have like a premonition and it happens? We all have had that, right?
It's like prophecy.
Right? So what is that? So there are people who train themselves through Kabbalistic study, as what my friend teaches, for example. There are people who train themselves to be more sensitive to that, right? And some people have a greater gift for it, and some people have less of a gift for it. And the fact of, or the teaching that says that the age of prophecy is behind us for whatever reasons does not.
There are also some people who have that gift that don't even know they have it, and they ignore it. They
Right.
ignore it, but they don't know what it is.
I was just going to say that the teaching that the age of prophecy is behind us does not diminish the importance or the power of the kind of self-training that Rambam's talking about. That stays the same, right? It's kind of like turn around, look at professional football players 40, 50 years ago, right? Go back to Super Bowl I. Right? These guys were skinny, flabby, they were nothing compared to the guys that we see out on the field today, right?
Smaller.
They were right, but it's got to do with training, and it's got to do with different techniques of weightlifting. It's got to do with steroids. It's got to do with all kinds of things, right? So you're going to say that they couldn't play football? So it's kind of like the reverse, right? We say it's like the age of prophecy was like today's football players, right? And today we're like, we're pikers, we're nobody. But the fact is, it's the same process. So we're playing the same game today. Sure. We can't take it upon us. the age of prophecy doesn't mean that we shouldn't be training ourselves to be prophets. The age of prophecy is over, it's not because we're not training ourselves. It's because God said, okay, I'm not telling you anymore. That's it, I'm not picking anybody. Rambam's saying, so, maybe we should be training ourselves more. Maybe if we did train ourselves, God would pick somebody. I don't know. I think this part hasn't changed.
Should we put a line of difference between knowledge and prophecy? They're two different things. Sometimes, about what we are speaking now, it seems there is a mixture between knowledge and prophecy.
So this is an interesting point. So knowledge basically in all philosophical, Western anyway, philosophical thought, up to and including and beyond time of Rambam, what does it mean when we say, like, God knows everything, right? So God knows, let's say, the concept of knowledge, which I think comes largely, again, as an outgrowth of Greek thought, right, is knowledge is not what's in a person's mind, but there are things that are capable of being known. Everything that exists in the world or that has happened in the world is capable of being known. Something that hasn't happened yet can't be known. It's not defined as knowledge. That make sense? Right?
A theory?
That's what prophecy
No,
is.
nothing.
That's what prophecy is.
So there was, I think it was...
Weather forecast.
No. I think it was Ibn Kaspi, who... can't remember the time, 100 years after Rambam? He was considered, they ultimately decided that he was a heretic. Because he basically, if I understand correctly, he basically said, God knows what I had for dinner last night, but God can't know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, because I haven't eaten dinner tonight yet. God can't know something that doesn't exist.
1279.
Sorry?
1279.
Okay, pretty good. I was going to say mid to late 1200s. Good, thank you.
But Hashem is supposed to see past, present, and future at the same time.
Says who? Right. Okay. So I'm saying that, 800 years ago, that wasn't taken as, and I'm not sure what it means when we say what we mean when we say that today, right? One way of looking at it today is to say, what does it mean that God knows? Because again, as Rambam says, the only frame of reference that we have to describe the world and to describe God is ourselves. Rambam says, so again, this is part of my introduction that didn't happen. It's okay. We'll do it as a prequel. Rambam says that there are two things that we can know from the Torah. One is the existence of God, and the other is that God is not only not material, but cannot be described in any of the terms that we use to describe the world of space, time, and motion. Right? And he says, why? Because the first two commandments, right? Anochi Hashem. So God said, okay, this is me, I'm here. And one. And when God says, don't have any other gods, Rambam says, so other God, what is other gods? Other gods live within a context, right? So if this is another God, right? This God is, by definition, composite. At the very least, it's made up of what's inside and the boundary of what's inside.
Because this God knows its place.
And then it exists within a larger context, right? So when God in the second commandment says, you don't have any other gods, right? That's it. God is saying, I crowd everything else out. There's no other room for anything to exist besides me, which at the beginning of Yisodei Torah, right? Rambam says there is a fundamental source of all existence, and nothing exists without that source of all existence. So Rambam says we can't describe or talk about God in any of the terms that we use to describe or talk about our world, and everything else is not clear. And everything else that we think we know is open to speculation and maybe even to doubt. And that's why we have, It's not shivim panim laTorah. The Torah doesn't have 70 faces. The Torah has limitless faces, right?
Is prophecy
Excuse me. So
only something in the future, or could it be something that's happened at the moment but somewhere else?
interesting. The way Rambam has described prophecy, remember, he says it's like a person says this is going to happen, and it happens, right?
Like intuition.
So I would say that, you know, knowing something that's happening someplace else at the moment that it's happening, to me that sounds like what I would call divination, and it may be related to prophecy. It may be, you know, a related gift, but prophecy, as Rambam has defined it for us, is the ability to tell what is going to happen in the future, right? So if we can tell what's going to happen in the future, that doesn't fit in. This is what I was saying a moment ago. This doesn't fit into the definition that traditional philosophical definition of knowledge, right? You can't know something that hasn't happened yet, right? So therefore, you can prophesy something that hasn't happened yet. That's a different process. That's not knowledge. Right? It's explicitly not knowledge, because Rambam told us it's like we perfect ourselves intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and imaginatively, and then when a flash of insight comes to us, out comes a message, and the message says, you know, a red car is going to go down the street, and you look out, and a blue car goes down the street, right? You look out, and a red car goes down the street. Great, you're a Gavalt, you're a prophet, right?
But isn't
The message
prophecy someone who's passing along a message received by God more than a prediction of the future?
Yes.
Yes.
That's how I always see it.
Yes, but the messages have to do with something that's going to happen in the future, right?
Or for every generation
Maybe. I mean,
to be present?
yeah. I mean, you know, they're for every generation, because if you read the prophetic books, it's like you would think that there would only have to be one, right? Where the prophet says, "Do what's right, don't do what's wrong," right? Remember Romper Room? Do be a do be, don't be a don't be. Can't believe I'm talking about Romper Room 2 days in a row, because it came up yesterday. So, you know, prophet says, you know, do justice, treat the, you know, take care of the weak and the poor and the sick and the orphan and the widow, and it's like really simple, right? And yet the prophets have to come in every generation, say it over and over and over and over and over again. So in that regard, unfortunately, it's a message for all time, because people are not, you know, as God recognizes right after the flood, right? Noah comes out and starts killing animals. God says, "Who told you to do that?" Read the text, right? Read the text.
But did you also say that one of the aspects of prophecy is also properly understanding the events of the past that have taken place, that is built on to understand what's going to take place in the future tense?
I think that's I think that is part of not prophecy. I think that's more like the rabbis say, haroyet and olad. That, you know, if you really understand how the world works, then you'll see a set of circumstances, and you'll be able to tell what's going to happen from it, right? Mm-hmm. That takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of mental discipline, right? But it's not necessary. It's really important, and it's very rare, but not necessarily. Sorry?
It could be a gift.
You know, it's a gift to be able to see things clearly. That's, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but, you know, I think it's pretty tough being able to see the world clearly.
I don't think prophecy is attainable by man. It can only be a gift given by God.
Rambam says
man is bound to time.
Rambam says it's a
learnable
you give an example.
It's a set of skills, yes, and then God decides.
Okay.
So you do it like you know.
It's not in my hand.
I think
In
it's
our hand.
I picture it like a school for prophecy is like you have the ability. It's like a radio. You have it on, but you don't have it on the channel, and so you're sitting there trying to tune it to get tuned in to what you want to hear. It's a preparation to get tuned in.
But you can also have it set to the right channel.
Well, I
And for
agree.
whatever reason,
I'm just saying
that,
if you
and for
have-
whatever reason, God decides they're going to broadcast into the house next to you and not into your house, or into your house and not into my house, right? But I think what Rambam has told us, and I think it's really, really important that we take this start, and I think it's fine that we're spending a lot of time today talking about this, right? We have the handbook in front of us of how to train ourselves for prophecy. And that's the way to find, as Rambam says, that's the way that we're going to find the palace and find our way into the palace, right? He says that again, having the right opinions, that's like memorization. That's not engaging ourselves. That's not engaging our unique God-given set of skills. That's not self-perfection. That's not working on ourselves. And in a sense, I would say that that's not properly valuing the gift that God gave me. God gave me a unique gift of my own. I'm not saying that I'm better, smarter, wiser than anybody else. It's not about that. But God gave me a unique blend of my intelligence, of my specific talents, of my specific emotional experience and makeup, and of my specific imaginative qualities. And so it's my task and my blessing and my duty in my life to work to perfect, Bezrat Hashem, to perfect all of those to the extent possible. And the more I do that, the more insights I will have, and the more I'll understand. And again, it's, because the world is set up in power structures, people will tell you, if you're going to do this, you can't do that. And Rambam is saying, who says? Who says? No. But, what God didn't tell us not to use our brain. God didn't tell us not to think. Adrabah, the people who become prophets are the people who go out and think, and then they struggle with it, right? And so we all have to struggle with it. What are we going to let other people do our thinking for us? The world is full of people who let everybody else do the thinking for them. And the few people who do the thinking, everybody else follows them. What a horrible way to live. No wonder the world's in such terrible shape today, okay? So Rambam is saying, no, take responsibility for your own relationship to God. Take responsibility for your own relationship to Torah. But don't discard it, right? And that's one of the most radical things possible, is to say...
Don't change it either.
Right. Well, it's one of the most radical things possible, is to say, just because you have, we've got the right opinions and we've got the halacha, we've got a way of life, right? And now you get the philosophy that makes you question it. Finally, you start asking questions. Asking questions is not the same as discarding. And that's the mistake that we are so often driven into. Again, it's a lot of it has to do with like power structures and the way that the way societies are built. It's like, well, if I'm going to embrace this, I can't embrace that. Who says? Who says? What? I can't be, I can't be an observant Jew and and strive Bezrat Hashem to live a Torah life, and at the same time have questions about it. If I don't have questions about it, then I'm not a human being. If I'm suppressing all the questions that I have about what I do in the course of the day, right?
The creation.
Gemara is all full of questions. I mean,
yeah, they were pretty radical guys.
In the structure of the creation, the four elements.
Yes.
What is time?
Where's time? I like that. I don't know.
It's linked to
Well, time, time is an expression of change, right? So, I'm not knowledgeable enough about his work in the guide to tell you that he does or doesn't have a theory of time. It's an interesting question. But I think time is, this is just me, right? Why does Sefer Bereshit open with the 7 days of creation? Because what the Torah is teaching us is not just teaching us about the fact that God creates the world, but God also, at that point of creation, so Rambam and Stephen Hawking, for example, agree, right, that before the creation there was no before. That's kind of that's a tautology,
God
right?
created time.
So, but by creating space and motion, time comes into existence, right?
Space and
But by but by spelling out the
Yes.
process of Maseh Bereshit, of the creation through 7 days, what the Torah is also telling us is that God didn't just create a world with physical things in it. God also, at the same time, creates process, change, growth, cycles, and that's also an expression. It also expresses itself as time.
This
But
is,
the Hellenists wouldn't agree with that. They say the universe always existed.
You know something? I think that Rambam basically said, first of all, that it's always existing doesn't necessarily mean that they don't recognize that time as an expression of change.
Change, yes, but they said there was no beginning.
Right. Rambam argues that, but I think it's also, I will say this as, I'll make the statement that Rambam himself, this is where Rambam says, I'm gonna rely on Torah and on revelation and on Chazal. Rambam himself, I think, says that we can't. There are a couple of things that we can't do. We can't do a control experiment, right? We cannot
duplicatable.
We cannot. Right. So there are things that are not duplicatable. One of them is the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu and Matan Torah. We can't replicate that. We can't replicate the creation. So we can't know, in the sense of intellectual, scientific, philosophical knowledge, we can't know whether the universe came into existence in one moment of creation, or whether it was in some undefinable sense always there, because also we don't know what eternity means, right? We can't define eternity, right? So Rambam's argument with Aristotle's notion of an eternally existing universe is not based on a scientific observation. It's not observable.
It's a statement.
Right? So he says, no, the Torah says it happened differently, and that's the way we're going to go. So I think Rambam has enough respect for the intellectual process that drove the philosophical project to take that question seriously and not to just dismiss it out of hand, and to say, no, the Torah teaches us that that's not the way it happened, which I think is a very important and a very courageous stance. He's saying, here's where we meet, or here's where we clash, right? And the fact that we clash doesn't mean that I'm going to discard all of these intellectual processes that I've learned so much from. Rabbi says, I'm going to take, Rambam says, you learn wisdom from wherever you get it, right? You can't, as they say, discard the baby with the bathwater, right? And there's tremendous wisdom to be gained from many other bodies of teaching. And so Rambam we are blessed to have before us the work of Rambam, who internalized and then personalized and turned into a great work of Torah, his exposure to Muslim thought, to Greek thought, and to the whole religious and philosophical and complex political situation of his time.
So